I'm still getting everyone in. We got a great turnout here, and we will get up and running in just a second. All right. Perfect. Well, welcome everybody to Chevalier's Books Online Edition. We are gathered here in cyberspace to celebrate the recent publication of Michael Schneyerson's BUGSY SIEGel. Really fortunate to have him here tonight, beaming in from New York City, staying up late. He'll be joined in conversation tonight with Willie Wilkerson, the writer and lecturer, the legend himself, who'll be in conversation with Michael tonight. We're also lucky enough to have Bert Deixler here, who's one of the co-owners of Chevalier's Books, who'll be introducing the two. First, a little bit of housekeeping. Michael and Willie are going to speak for a little while and be in conversation, and then we'll open it up to questions at the end of the session with about 15 minutes left. If you have questions, you can go ahead and post them down in the chat on the bottom of the right screen, and then I will relay them to Michael and Willie when we get there. And perhaps most importantly, if you would like a copy of this book and haven't yet gotten it, I'm going to shortly post a link down in the chat where you can go buy it on bookshop.com. Or if you're in LA or around LA, we've got copies at the bookstore. So swing on by. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it off to Bert to do the intros, and thanks for being here.
Great. Thank you. Thank you all for being here at the oldest bookstore in Los Angeles. We're 81 years old, and the best reason to own a bookstore, aside from the rivers of money which flow in, of course, is the fact that we get to have a wonderful, interesting guests talk about their books, and tonight is no exception. Our interlocutor tonight, and I believe also who will be quite a raconteur, is Willie Wilkerson, famously the author of The Man Who Invented Las Vegas, a book about his father. He directly intersects with BUGSY SIEGel, as you will learn when we talk about who was the person who really thought of Las Vegas and bought the property to get going. And we're lucky to have Willie with us tonight. And our guest author is Michael Shnayerson, who is famously written this book on BUGSY SIEGel. It appears in the Jewish Lives series put out by Yale University. I believe Michael first considered doing a piece on Maimonides, but decided all things being equal, that maybe BUGSY SIEGel would make for a bigger turnout and sell more books. I've read this book now twice because I found it so fast, so interesting, so well written. There is from time to time, as we would have expected, Michael's inability to not try to channel Raymond Chandler in some of the language that he uses, and it is just a wonderful read, perfect for a midsummer weekend. And so I'm just so delighted to have Willie and Michael here, and I will now shut up and let the festivities begin. So thank you both for being here.
Well, thank you, Bert. Willie, you want to get it going?
Okay, so where do we want to start? Do we want to start around Prohibition?
Well, I thought we could kind of, I could say a little bit about Ben's earliest days and how Prohibition changed everything for him, because I think that leads us into a first look at how Prohibition affected your father and how the 30s unfolded as a result. So let me just jump in and say that I wrote this book not frankly because I had a long-standing interest in BUGSY, although I would come to have one, but this wonderful series, Jewish Lives, has published like 50 of these short biographies of distinguished Jews of one field or another. And the founder of the series just had this sort of perverse idea to assign one of these to BUGSY, because after all, gangsters are part of the Jewish American experience and part of what was going on the Lower East Side in the late 19th century and early 20th. And so I took his point, and I've spent a couple of years loving this subject. And it's interesting. almost everybody has heard of Bugsy Siegel. You know, they may not know exactly who he was or how he relates to Meyer Lansky or whatever, but there's something about him, the color, the handsomeness, and yet the, you know, the cold-eyed glint in his eye, perfectly capable of shooting you down in an instant. It's fascinating to people. So I was intrigued, for starters, by the way that Ben sort of went off on his own by the age of 10. He had grown up in a family that had come from Galicia, and they lived on the Williamsburg side of the bridge, then on the lower Manhattan side. An Orthodox family. They only spoke Yiddish at home. But by 10 years old, Ben was this tough, really tough kid on the streets around Cannon Street, where his family lived. And he probably would have ended up as a, you know, serious con man, or a serious convict, I should say, if something very amazing hadn't happened, and that was Prohibition. Prohibition, as you know, began in 1920. Ben was at that point 14 years old. His best friend, Meyer Lansky, was a few years older, but the two of them had the opportunity of their lives, because they soon became the guards for the bootleggers. They began to earn extraordinary amounts of money. They actually, by the time they were in their late 20s, they were living in suites at the Waldorf Astoria. So it's a fascinating time in his life. And I wonder, was your father old enough to participate in the Prohibition era, or is he a little later than that?
Well, it's interesting you should say that, because my dad established a series of really high-end speakeasies in Manhattan.
Mm-hmm.
One that required a membership of $1,500 in 1926. I mean, that was a tremendous amount of money.
Wow.
So I think that was the first point of intersection, because my dad bought booze from Meyer Lansky. Whether he actually knew Siegel at that time, we don't know. Mm-hmm. But he bought his booze from two sources: Joe Kennedy and Meyer Lansky.
Fascinating.
So that's the first point of intersection in terms of Prohibition.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then so do you want to take it from there and take Bugsy into after Prohibition?
I'll take him just a little way into the 30s. The 20s, before we leave them, I should say, was a time of not only great financial success, but pervasive violence. In fact, Meyer and Ben formed something called the Ben and Meyer Mob, and they actually would kill people pretty much on, you know, command. So this is how they got through the 20s, although it's worth mentioning a winsome moment in 1929 when they both decided it was time to get married, and they married these local girls from the Lower East Side. Each was the other's best man, and there was a rabbi officiating at each service. My editor's Jewish Lives like that detail. But of course, even as they established families for themselves, they were engaging in a brutal effort, really, to take control of gangsterdom in New York. And so by 1929 or 30, I think it is, there's the famous gathering in Atlantic City. Lucky Luciano and others established what they call the syndicate. And they anticipate that Prohibition is about to end, as indeed it does. Meyer goes down to Florida to create an empire there of, you know, bars and horse racetracks and whatnot. Ben goes to LA, and he essentially starts taking control of all sorts of places there, from dog tracks to to nightclubs. And I can only imagine that there's a second point of intersection there in those years, because your father began running some of the most stylish, popular restaurants in LA, and probably Ben was somewhere in there.
Well, he did. I mean, there's lots of references in books to where he and Virginia Hill would actually rent one of his nightclubs, Ciro's, for an entire night or for parties or whatever. So there's definitely that point of intersection. But I just want to go back a little bit about the violence question that you raised, because these were guys from Murder Inc. And, they made themselves out to be tough guys and nobody messed with them. What I find fascinating about this period is that every gang member had his own specific task. For instance, in the Bugs Meyer gang, you had Meyer Lansky, who was the numbers man, and he was a genius. There was no question about it. I talked to Mo Sedway's widow, B. Sedway. She said, this person did this, this person did that. And I asked her, I said, well, what did Bugsy Siegel do? She says, he was the hitman. That's what he was good at.
Yeah.
Okay. That was his job, to go out and kill people.
Yeah.
So that aspect I found, and by the way, the people that I talked to who knew him said that he relished that. I mean, it wasn't something that he soul searched about. It was something that if a job needed to be done, I mean, he not only planned hits. The sense I got is that he didn't delegate this responsibility to anybody else.
Right.
He pulled the trigger himself.
That's so interesting, Willie. But you just said something that really fascinates me, which is the people you talked to who knew him. Did you talk to people who? Is that possible chronologically that you talked to people who talked to Ben?
Oh yes,
Wow.
I actually knew people who. I was very fortunate to interview my father's longtime personal secretary, George Kennedy, who I referenced many times. Not only the Man Who Invented Las Vegas, but my most recent book, Hollywood Godfather. And if it's okay to mention here,
of course,
everybody likes to think of Bugsy Siegel as the sociopath and thuggish brute and all that. And yes, he was all of that. But George told me a story that brings an element of humanity into this man's life. There was a point when they were working, my father and Siegel were working jointly on the Flamingo, and they would have meetings at my dad's office on a regular basis. And it was one Saturday that they were meeting there, and my father required George Kennedy, a secretary, to be there to take minutes or do whatever. And George got a phone call that his older brother Harry was dying and asked to be excused from the meeting. And my dad said, I like you back. My father, the Ebenezer Scrooge, says, I'd like you back. And George returned 2 or 3 hours later, absolutely crestfallen. And Siegel sensed that. He said, Georgie, what happened? And George said, Mr. Siegel, my brother died in my arms. And George got up and started walking across the hall to his office. And he heard footsteps behind him. And he turned around, and there's Siegel, tears streaming down his cheeks. And according to George, he took out a toilet roll of $100 bills and pressed it into George's hand. And he said, Georgie, keep it, Georgie, keep it. Well, George didn't. But I was very touched by that story because it gives us a window into this man, to this dichotomy of his personality, where he can be a killer one moment. And the people that I talked to who knew him, I couldn't find one person who had a bad thing to say about him. One person played bridge with him.
Well, they were alive. These people you talked to were alive.
Yes.
They had,
Well, yes. It's really interesting because when I first met B and we first went out to lunch, we had ordered our meals, and she turned to me, she says, how did your dad die? And I thought that was very telling because, at the end, the Flamingo, when it became very hairy and people's lives were being threatened and people were dying and stuff like that. She felt she wanted to know how if my father was part of that mayhem.
Yeah.
So
How interesting. We'll get back to that in the Flamingo. I want to take us
Sure,
back a little bit
sure.
into the 30s, because it's such an interesting period. It really is sort of the Chinatown period, and the great cars and the clothes and the gangsters. And Ben rather quickly established himself with ownership interests in various dog tracks and offshore gambling boats and the race wire, the illegal horse racing. And he quickly got so wealthy that he began building this mansion, this 23-room mansion up in the hills. And he brought his family out there occasionally, but mostly he kept them in Scarsdale, and he presided over poker games that celebrities, that actors would come to. The only actor who ever failed to appreciate Ben's hospitality was Jimmy Stewart, apparently, who felt morally that it was appalling for any of them to actually be there. But at any rate, it was an amazing mansion. It was an amazing life he led. He called himself a sportsman, which is I find just delightful. We would think of a sportsman as someone who might play polo or be a yachtsman, but a sportsman included the murders, the contract murders that were sometimes necessary. And you're absolutely right that for my reporting also suggests that Ben not only was perfectly capable of killing people on command, but that he did get some perverse pleasure out of the planning. And so we know that in 1939 or 8, that Big Harry Greenberg, a member of the syndicate, had rather foolishly started spilling the beans and telling his superiors that if they didn't make him alone, he was going to, tell all he knew. So that was, of course, signing his own death sentence. They find out that Harry is in L.A. They turn to Ben. This involves a long story about racketeering and Lepke, and we can't get to them. But at any rate, they tell Ben to deal with this as he sees fit, and he plans this whole hit operation on Big Harry, who is living in seclusion with his wife in a little apartment, and the only time he ever goes out is at 11 p.m. to get the newspaper. Anyway, Ben plans it and gives himself not the giveaway car or the chase car, but switches them, which makes no sense at all, except his idea, which he says to the police when he was arrested, is he thought that the police would assume that this car was the chase car when it wasn't, and therefore he wouldn't be charged. Well, he did get arrested, and in fact, there's a little intersection with your father and Ciro's there, because he's
food delivery.
Yes, food delivery. He's put in jail pending a trial. Only it's not jail the way any of us would experience jail. There's a prison official to make handmade uniforms for him, and among other things, there's your father to bring him gourmet meals.
Oh yes, it was Uber Eats before Uber Eats. I do want to interject something, because I think it's very important.
I think interjection is the theme here. Yes, go ahead.
At some point, Michael, all of these guys yearn for legitimacy. And I think that's part of the reason why Siegel came out to, excuse me if I have voice, came out to Hollywood.
Yeah.
One of the things that is not known is that Siegel craved to be an actor. He wanted to be a leading man like his friend George Raft, who was a matinee idol.
Yeah.
And so Siegel had glossies done of himself. There's a screen test someplace of himself.
Yeah.
He really wanted to, he was just enthralled, by the movie Colony.
Yeah.
And and he was tolerated, by the Harry Cohens and Daryl Zanuck and stuff like that. But all the while, it was very standoffish. I mean, at arm's length, because they knew where this guy was coming from.
Right.
But I found that absolutely fascinating, that this guy was really, running a double life. Here he wanted to be an actor like his friend George Raft, but at the same time, he was running the numbers and the tracks and everything else.
Right. Yeah.
So,
there's a little appendage to your story about wanting to be an actor. Apparently, one day he went to the set of a movie that George Raft was doing with Marlene Dietrich, and he had a sort of suitcase with him, Ben did. And at the end of a scene, he opened the suitcase and it had a movie camera. And he said, now let's do that scene with me in the lead. And so they did the scene. He had remembered all his lines. He hit them pretty well. Apparently George Raft thought, God, maybe Ben is really going to be an actor. I think it was probably a very quick fizzle, because anyone who would have, been in the position of auditioning Ben would have been terrified for his life.
Yeah.
So instead, Ben played the part, right? I mean, just say a little bit about how he dressed, how he comported himself, the things he did that made him so, kind of glam.
Well, one of the things, a story that just popped in my mind. B. Sedway told me an enormous amount of information. She told me that she knew who killed Bugsy, but because of statute of limitations, she wasn't.
Yeah.
But basically, she told me a lot of other things. But she told me one fascinating story, which I'm absolutely sure is true. It's Prohibition. They're in Little Italy, and they're at a small Italian restaurant, and they're about to sit down and eat. And in a scene right out of a movie, there's a car that drives by with two Tommy guns that shoot out the windows. Okay. Yeah. Siegel turns over the table to shield himself and is returning fire. B. Sedway is crawling on her stomach to the ladies' room, for cover. And she waits until all the shooting has died down. Now a normal person would say, I'm out of here. The windows are shot out. The police are coming. I'm not sure if anybody was hurt. She made it sound like there wasn't. But she emerges from the ladies' room. They've reset the table and they're serving the antipasta.
We think that story is true.
Well, the thing is that what to me is that it's the mind of this gangster who is like a chameleon, who is able to reset itself. Yeah. 1 minute he's defending himself behind a wooden table in an Italian restaurant, and the next minute it's over. Obviously, that shootout was to send a message. Okay, right. And he's hungry and he wants to sit down and eat.
Well, God bless him. That's a great story. I mean, there are 2 or 3 other of these great sort of shootout in the Italian restaurant scenes. There was the war between the Mustache Petes, so-called, in the early 30s in New York, where each of these 2, I think, Sicilian gang leaders were fighting for domination, and one of them got shot. So goes the story. Seated at a big round table, having a big bowl of pasta. Lucky Luciano is sitting with him. He's in on the plan to kill the guy. He goes back to the bathroom, and there's a gun that's in the toilet case. Now, if this is starting to sound familiar to The Godfather, it is.
Oh, yeah.
Very familiar. But this is a story told by, to my mind, the best biographer of Bugsy. Anyway, and Lucky Luciano comes out with guns blazing and shoots the guy. And at the same time, a car squeals up to the curb, and Ben, remember Ben, is at the wheel. So I mean, who knows? As I say at about that point in my book, I say, by now, as a biographer, you start to realize that none of these stories, or very few of them, are provable. You just don't. I mean, gangsters don't tend to tell stories.
They don't.
And so what do you do with it as a biographer? And I think what you do is you you say to your readers, look, we can't know for sure that this happened, but it fits in with the milieu, with the feeling of the times. And if it didn't happen, so what? It's a great
Yeah.
story.
Well, it's really interesting that you should mention dress,
Yeah.
which is the next thing I want to. Bugsy used to come. My father had a haberdashery and a barber shop called Sunset House in 1936. That was another point of intersection.
Really?
My father's chief barber was a man by the name of Harry Drucker,
Ah, I
who
heard about him.
owned, yeah, and Harry and Ben Siegel were very, very close friends. And he was another person who I interviewed who knew Ben Siegel, who could tell me his stories about Ben Siegel. But what I find interesting again is that the gangsters that seeped outside of their paradigm, and we're talking, Bugsy Siegel, Lucky Luciano, John Gotti, these flashy dressers were the ones who got, caught or killed.
Right.
So the ones that were very, subdued and dressed in manner, we're talking Meyer Lansky and, the others, those were the ones who decided, we're not here to make a statement. We're flying under the radar. We know what we're doing. But again, it feeds into that issue that at some point, a group of these guys really learned for legitimacy. They were tired of looking over their shoulder.
Yeah.
And they were saying to themselves, how can I dress? What can I do to fit in? Can I go to California? Can I date movie stars so I can get this stigma off my back? And I completely understand that.
I do too, and I think it's a poignant aspect of this story. You think about the Italian gangsters who've been operating for hundreds of years and are proud of that legacy, proud and would and hope that their children and grandchildren can inherit the family business. Not the Jewish gangsters. They really wanted to get out of it in a generation, if possible. They wanted their kids to go to good schools. I think Meyer Lansky's son went to West Point. I mean, and it's
they wanted to blend in.
Yeah, they wanted to blend in, and I think that as a result, by certainly the mid to late 50s, you correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me by then, you do have organized crime in Las Vegas, but it's much more muted. It's much more businesslike. It's not swaggering and obvious the way Ben was when he threw open the doors of the Flamingo.
Right.
And as long as I mention that, I think we should jump fairly quickly there because there's so much to talk about. And I want to just come up to it this way. By 1941 or so, really 1942, Ben had just barely gotten off, just beaten the rap on the murder of Big Harry Greenbaum. He only survived that because Abe Relis was killed and couldn't testify against him. So Ben was lucky enough to get out without being executed. He sort of left a whole life in LA behind him because he sold the mansion. He knew he had overdone it. Everyone in LA now knew that this guy was at heart, just a violent murderer. So the celebrities no longer came around. What was left for him to do? Start a new life in Las Vegas. So at that time, 1941, let's call it, what was your father's career up until that point?
Well, he was the publisher of the Hollywood Reporter, which garnered an immense power by 1941.
Right.
And he was still, running successful, nightclubs. There was Ciro's Cafe Trocadero. LaRue came later on. But in this mix, another point of intersection with these gangsters was my father was a horrendous gambler. It was kind of like being a junkie and where you buy your junk. So he was absolutely losing fortunes by 1945. I mean, he was just losing his shirt.
Like $1 million a year, I remember reading.
Yeah, oh, it was terrible. It was terrible. You know, and I've got a lot of these gambling checks. I mean, when you see the date and when you see the amounts,
Jesus.
you know, $500 a day on each race at the track in 1944, 1945, when the median income in the United States was about $2,200. I mean, it just gives you the shivers.
Yeah.
So he, you know, legitimately, I mean, he was on the other side of the fence raking in all this money.
Yeah.
So don't think he didn't go unnoticed by people like Meyer Lansky and Siegel and whatever.
Yeah.
And that was their reason for getting into, I'm sort of jumping ahead a little bit, but that was one of the reasons for them approaching my dad saying, gee, you're good at starting and creating these successes. We want to tag along for the ride. We're not going to get in your way, but we want to be part of this action.
Yeah.
So basically, it was my dad's chronic gambling that led him to the Nevada desert, because it was the only place that was had legal gambling. You know, Michael, I think the audience should know, you and I know this, but prior to Las Vegas, Hollywood was Las Vegas before Las Vegas was Las Vegas. I mean, it was dotted with casinos. There was bordellos, elegant bordellos up in the hills, in the Hollywood Hills. I mean, you know, and if you didn't have enough of that, you had the gambling ships off the Santa Monica coast. I mean, it was all there.
Yeah.
So when you had the shutdown, when Earl Warren shut down gambling, I'm trying to remember when that, but
about 1939 or 40.
Around the time that we're talking about, this wonderful cottage industry that had this sort of symbiotic relationship with Hollywood and the movie colony, you know, just vanished. And so it left all of these people, including my father, of, okay, well, where do you go? They did have the private poker games, but that only went so far. They didn't touch the tracks, which I find really interesting. And so my father kept making these trips to Vegas. He would hire, you know, private planes. I guess today it'd be like a Learjet. And he would fly to Vegas and he would spend the afternoon there gambling, and then fly back to LA again. And it was during that time when the light dawned on him and he realized, okay, here's a place with legal gambling. His friend, Joseph Skank, who was the chairman of 20th Century Fox Pictures, who was also a gambler on steroid. You know, Skank could get away with it because he was printing money at 20th Century Fox. My father was on the verge of, not bankruptcy, but I mean, it was really tough for him. But it was Skank who told my dad, listen, if you're going to lose this kind of money, build a casino, own the casa, because the theory is that if you lost, the money would be cleverly recycled.
That's it. It was like play money.
Right, exactly.
You get it all back at the end of the evening.
You know, the other thing we have to understand is that the psychological component, there was no help for chronic gamblers at that time, like AA or anything like that. The afflicted had to fend for himself. So this was my father's one and only attempt at therapy. Build a casino and a resort so that I could go there, lose all I want, and not lose my shirt.
Yeah, it's a marvelous story and setup. And of course, in the Bugsy movie, which I liked quite a lot, there's a classic moment when Warren Beatty surveys this. He says to the car, the driver, pull over. They're just south of Vegas. They've had a afternoon or night gambling. And here's this stretch of land, 33-acre sort of tumbleweed property, which is for sale. And you can answer one question for me, which is who actually saw the land first, and who gets credit for putting the flamingo there?
Oh, okay. So
it's either Meyer Lansky, or it's Ben, or it's your father.
Okay. So I heard this from Greg Boutzer, my father's attorney, so that pretty much comes verbatim as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
The story goes, and I write about this in The Man Who Invented Las Vegas, is the two places that my dad stayed was the El Rancho and the Last Frontier. They were the only so-called resorts. I mean, by today's standards, they would be more motels or motor courts rather than what we experience today as these,
Right.
gigantic empires. And my dad and his business partner, Tommy Seward, were staying the weekend. Tommy used to keep my dad company when he gambled. I don't know, to keep an eye on
Yeah.
finances, who knows? But they're driving now to the airport, and this for sale sign that says 33 acres for sale with a phone number. And my dad barks at Tommy and says, take that number down. And that's really the sort of the genealogy of what happened.
That
Now
is
it's
really,
interesting you
yeah.
should bring. Now it's
ahead.
really interesting you should bring this up, because the other day I was reviewing the title search for this property, and it's all over the place. In March of 1944, my dad wrote a check for down payment to Margaret Folsom, and that check is now at the Mob Museum in Vegas.
Yeah.
In September of 1945, the land is deeded to Mo Sedway. Now, Mo Sedway and Gus Greenbaum were hired by my dad. They were very close to my dad, but my dad hired them to run the gambling for the Flamingo.
Right. So let me just jump in here, because I see that we're running out of time.
Yeah.
And so all of those people were involved, including, as you say, Greg Boutzer, the lawyer. But it happens, and the deal is made, and your father is pursuing his dream, but he keeps gambling and loses even more money. And the backers, Meyer Lansky and others, say, well, here's a partner that you could who will help you keep on track and get this thing built. And he looks up, and it's Ben, and apparently that's the first time he realized that his partners had brought in Ben Siegel as a partner, and so for a while that worked out just great. Ben was full of praise for your father. He remembered the meals in prison from Ciro's. But the fact was, Ben was really incapable of being an acolyte, if you will, for very long. He had to control everything. And so it's very interesting that only a few months later, after this sort of forced marriage, shotgun marriage between the two to become partners of the Flamingo, which the whole mob has backed, that relationship falls apart. And your father, pretty quickly, is not only pushed out of the business, but goes to Paris to stay alive.
Yeah, Siegel threatened his life. I just need to go back just a little bit,
okay?
Because in the story of my dad's life, there are moments like with Bugsy Siegel, where if Bugsy Siegel only stuck to his role, he was there to watchdog syndicate interest. Okay. My dad and everybody else would have been multimillionaires.
Yes.
But there is this fascinating psychological component.
Yes.
Where one becomes greedy and the whole house collapses.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
You see that with Bugsy. Prior to that, my dad ran a scheme with a gangster Johnny Roselli to shake down the movie studios. Okay. Yep. And Billy Byoff, who was the guy who went around, collecting the money and was the union boss, decided that no, he wanted to run things for himself. Had he not done that, they probably would have shaken down the studios, for decades. Yes.
Instead, they end up getting in each other's way, and the whole scheme falls apart.
So that's exactly what happened with Ben Siegel. Number one, he would have been a millionaire. Number two, he would have been alive.
Yeah.
And number three, he would have found his path of legitimacy, because there's no doubt in my mind that, knowing my father as his biographer like I do, he would have said to Ben, after Ben had proven himself, look, you want to take over as the entertainment or hospitality, or you want to run this or run that. But my God, it was a short time later, and not even the ink was dried on the contract when Ben refused to be in office anymore.
Yeah. Willie, I have two questions for you.
Sure.
And I think after those, we're going to have to take some questions, although I could talk with you all night. I love this stuff. But my first question is, do you think, do you have any evidence, or maybe Mo Sedway's wife has a thought on whether Ben did skim from the casino, perhaps encouraged by Virginia Hill, who was also said to be skimming, and did that seal his death warrant? Or do you have any thoughts on that?
I personally don't think he did. I know that's an accepted, logical conclusion, and I get that. The sense that I got talking to the people who knew him, my father's close associates, is that he really loved the flamingo. Again, this was his baby. This was his path to legitimacy. The problem is that he was a babe out of water. He didn't know about hotel budgeting, about construction. And I think that was really his downfall. The other part of his downfall was when he started overselling the stock in the flamingo.
Oh, yeah. And people's stocks, it turns out they were worth 10% of what they thought.
They were just, at that point, this is a guy who was incapable of asking for help. His ego was so great. He should have come to my dad, who was very fatherly, to the people who approached him, and said, look, I'm in trouble with this and that or whatever, can you help me out? Or he could have gone to Meyer Lansky. Incidentally, and I know I'm jumping ahead a little bit, I'm not buying the traditional reason that his partners killed Siegel. Meyer Lansky was like a brother.
Yes.
Well, and he would have prevented that. So I think that there was another reason when my father was told to by an anonymous caller to stay in Paris until it was all over. I believe, and those in my father's camp believe, that Roselli, who was very close to my dad, was protecting my dad against Siegel. He took Siegel out in order to protect my dad, which to me
isn't that fascinating? That was the other question, of course. I wanted to ask. I didn't feel that we could end without a little speculation on who did indeed kill Ben. It's a shocking, fascinating moment in the annals of organized crime. 10 p.m. June 20th, 1947. Here's Ben back from dinner with friends. The whole last day of his life is actually reported in astonishing detail, because newspapers could do that at that time. And there were a few other people who were interviewed who talked about having seen him at one moment or another that day. He's gotten through this day. He comes home. He's at Virginia Hill's house. She's off in Paris. In hiding. That's right. And not only that, but apparently she took 75 furs with her to Paris in the summer. Anyway, here he is alone. He opens the paper and he gets riddled with bullets. It's fascinating, of course, to speculate. But I just find it amazing that he could be so cavalier at that moment. The Flamingo had only opened in December 26th. At that time, it was a disaster. It needed to be closed. It needed to be, finished, renovated so that people could begin to come there. They did, however, begin to come there by April or May. And apparently by then, for the first time since it's opening in December, it began to make money. So, I'm sure that Ben felt, as he sat there opening the paper in the evening, that he'd be fine. The place was not making money. What did he have to be afraid of? And then, boom.
Yeah, well, it's very sad that one of his closest friends, Alan Smiley, fingered him. Because I talked to people who knew Alan Smiley, and they said there was the first round that pierced Bugsy's skull. That was the warning round. That gave Smiley enough time to duck into the fireplace.
But are you suggesting that Smiley had anything to do with it?
Well, he was the one. Somebody had to get Siegel to the couch in front of that window so that the shooter could take a shot. You can't do it through brick walls. And either Smiley was coerced on the level that he would be brought down with Siegel, or a member of his family was shot. You know how gruesome these things can get.
But
my sources told me who knew Smiley, that there was that first warning shot, but it was a clear shot that killed Siegel instantly.
Yes. Yeah. Not only did it kill him, but one of his eyes was propelled to the opposite wall.
Yeah.
I mean, it's hard to conceive.
The interesting thing is that the shooter, who was an excellent marksman, could have killed him with one shot.
Yes.
But the gang message is, you got to empty an entire clip into this guy.
Yeah.
To send a message saying that this gang has been here.
Yeah.
When I interviewed B. Sedway, and this is kind of off topic, but I said, how did your gang operate? And she said, well, we had a 5-year rule. And I said, well, what the hell is that? And she said, if somebody offended us, and this was after Siegel apparently died, but if somebody offended us, we would wait 5 years, and on 5 years on the day, we would kill that person. Well, I never gave that a second thought. But she and Susie Berman, and you know who that is, okay? Davy and Chicky Berman. Susie Berman was like a daughter to B. Sedway. Apparently, Susie Berman was a writer and said some terrible things about Mo Sedway, her beloved husband, who I think passed away.
5 years later, she's dead.
With 2 bullets to the skull. Okay.
God.
And so the papers came out and said it's not a mob slang or whatever. But I think, one bullet you can pass off. When there's multiple bullets, especially to the head, that's the message.
Well, I think we're going to stop on that message here. But Willie, that's so it's really terrific. I love this.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Oh, listen, you're the best. Now, Shel.
Yeah, this is great. We've got a couple questions. I think we've got some Siegel wonks in the audience here. So
okay, so how do I see the other people? How do I do that?
Before we start though, Michael, I think for those of us who've read the book and those of us who will be buying the book at Chevalier's Books and reading it, you have to explain your theory of who killed Ben Siegel. Don't leave it hanging. You owe it to us.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. Well, you mentioned a salient fact here, Willie, which is that the shooter used a rifle.
A carbine.
Of some kind, a carbine, right.
30-30, yeah.
Now, when I chatted with Nick Pileggi about all this, and of course, he's a great student of it, author of Goodfellows, etc. He said it's very unusual for mob hits to be done with a rifle. I mean, they're done with pistols, or else they take you out in the desert.
At close range, yeah.
Yeah. So why did this guy have a carbine anyway? And what Nick's theory, it's a little baroque, but I'll be as precise as I can. Things had not been going well between Virginia and Ben. And then, of course, there was also the problem that they may have been skimming money and that they may have felt that their lives were in danger. Certainly, Ben's was in danger. So then you have that turn of events you mentioned, which is that Virginia goes to Paris to be away from things. I think, or Nick Pileggi thinks, and I've sort of improvised on what he said, that the shooter was actually Virginia's young brother. Chicky or Chucky. And that he was furious with Ben because Ben had begun to get quite abusive with his older sister. And further, if he took action and killed Ben, then he would be essentially erasing the black mark that was on his back as well as his sister's. Whereas if they did nothing about Ben, then Virginia would be, implicated in this skimming operation as far as they were concerned, and the mobsters might go after her. So if they shot Ben, then they accomplished two things. Ben, this abusive guy, is out of his sister's life, and B, the death sentences are removed from their backs. That's my theory.
Yeah, it's very possible. If he was a damn good shot.
Yeah.
And of course, they never found the weapon.
Right.
as
They
well.
found the shells, and there were 9 shells, 9
There were
bullets,
none-
but
yeah,
they didn't find.
they never found the weapon.
Yeah.
Miles, do you have some questions in the
Yeah, I
chat
got some
or
questions. So I'll
elsewhere?
just read them to you, and then Michael and Willie, you can jump
Okay.
in. So first one's from Bob. Bob wants to know, what was the impact of LAPD's Chief William Parker upon persuading Ben Siegel and his backers to leave LA for Las Vegas?
Okay, Michael, that's your question.
No, it's yours. Because I don't know the answer.
Well, I didn't know that William Parker was a contemporary of Ben Siegel's.
Are we talking about the guy who was the police chief in Beverly Hills?
Well, Fletcher Bowron and
One
people
guy
like,
wrote a book about the murder.
but I'm not sure about Parker. I think came later. That's my guess.
All right, you've stumped the experts here.
Yeah,
Whoever
new
you are.
assignment. Yeah.
Next
Go ahead.
question.
Can you hear me? This is Bob Corbin.
Yes. we
Yeah,
can hear
go
you.
ahead.
Chief
hear you.
Parker became the chief shortly after the end of World War II. He
Okay.
was a retired Marine colonel who was the temporary chief after World War II. And Parker, who had served in the LAPD prior to the war and was very unpopular with the command staff for a variety of activities that sought to prevent firing of police officers on the command staff and give them civil service protections, became the chief. And he was a real tough moralist, and probably was the chief around 48 or so.
Yeah.
And
But we don't have any evidence that he. I mean, do you saying he played some role? And
well, my understanding of the history of gambling and mob affairs in LA, and it's certainly not expert knowledge, is that between all the card clubs and the unincorporated communities and the corruption of the various police departments, the mob was operating pretty freely, as you described.
well, that's for sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
And,
I mean,
and
that's
Parker,
the whole Chinatown thing.
that Parker really clamped down.
Recording in
Yeah.
progress.
Okay, next question.
So this one comes from Mark. So Mark says, I'm a great nephew of Ben's and have done
Wow.
tons of research down to getting the FBI files on him. How much of your book is from source material and how much from previously published sources?
Michael, that's your question.
Yes, I can do that.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, there's a lot of historical research about the Lower East Side in the late 19th century, early 20th century, and so the family's early years, plenty of history there, including one of the most interesting places to go is the census reports and also the ship's logs, which tell you certain key facts about any family that fills out a census. By the 30s, when Ben is out in LA, there's a lot of newspaper coverage that begins to occur, especially when he gets involved with Big Harry Greenberg. So that helped. There's a particularly good biography called "We Only Shoot Each Other," and that's by
Dean Jennings.
Dean Jennings. That's it.
Yeah.
Wonderful book written when this guy was a real shoe leather reporter. I think it was about 1967. He was old enough, or young enough, I should say, that some of these characters we've been talking about were still alive, like George Raff, for instance. So his biography of Ben has lots of wonderful anecdotes. Are any of them true? I have no idea. It doesn't have notes. It's not written with academic gravitas, but it's a hell of a fun read. And a lot of the best stories about Ben are in that. So that's a start. I'll just add that, yes, there's all these FBI.
Are you there?
Oh,
Oh, he froze
Ooh.
up.
Got some
We're being hacked by the Chinese. I knew it.
technical difficulties.
well, looks like it's Michael's issue.
Yeah, Michael is frozen.
Oh, geez.
in a very
Well, until we get him
in a
back
very
on, you
contemplative pose. Yeah.
yeah. Is there a question that I can answer while we're getting Michael back?
Yeah, I see. So Paul wants to know, this is maybe a good one to end on too. Were Siegel and his cohorts at all preoccupied with the Red Scare atmospherics?
My dad was heavily involved with that. I can see, I mean, that came in the late 40s. And then of course there was the McCarthy era that, began in 1950. I can't see, the gangsters were primarily occupied with business, and I can't see them, being involved politically like that. I could be wrong, but their stock and trade was commerce, was business.
Let's, I would like to thank Michael, but unfortunately I'll have to call him, I guess, to do that.
Oh, geez.
So let me thank Willie.
I think he's departed and is trying to beam back in.
Yeah, the ghost of Bugsy is finally caught up with us.
Yeah. Now we can have a conspiracy of
yeah.
Yes.
Do we have time for another question, or is that?
I was, I'll throw my hand in for one last one. What is it about this period of American history that holds so many's imagination? We're almost 100 years on from this. We all got supercomputers in our pockets, and yet these stories of Las Vegas and gangsters and Bugsy Siegel, it seems like a particular fascination in the American mythology. Do you have a sort of sense of maybe why it's such an enduring niche interest for so many people?
One word, Miles: glamour. We think about the cars, the clothes, my dad's restaurants and nightclubs people had to dress up with. It was the ambience of the times, especially when you look at the old photographs of the times. I mean, it just reeks with glamour. And so I think it's a kind of a nostalgia for the past, because on one hand, we would like to see ourselves in those black and white photos, eating at those restaurants, dressed in those clothes and driving those cars.
Willie, just want to say I'm back.
Oh, great! Thank you.
There he is.
I know you tried to take care of me with a hit, but I've dodged the bullets, and I'm here.
It was that carving.
Anyway, I'm sorry I missed a couple of minutes there, but
Michael, let me just say how much I appreciate your taking the time to do this, how wonderful I thought your book is. Willie, I so appreciate your doing this.
It's my pleasure.
We'll help support the oldest independent bookstore in Los Angeles by buying Michael's book and buying Willie's book, which is also at our store. So thank you all for being here tonight.
Well, thank you so much, and I appreciate it. And Michael, it's a pleasure meeting all of you guys.
Yes, Willie, I'm going to be in LA before too long, and I'm going to look you up, and we'll have some more good talk about this.
Well, listen, pal, you're not going to find me because I'm only 2 miles from the Canadian border.
Oh,
so
I thought you were somehow. I thought you were in LA, but all
right.
No.
There are too many hits waiting for me there.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone.
Nice meeting everybody.
All right.
Okay,
like
take
Bird
care now.
said,
Okay.
Like Bird said, if you'd like a copy of this, bookshop.com. The link is in the chat. It's also on our website, or you can stop by the store and pick up one for yourself. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time in Chevalier's Online.
Okay, take care.
Take care.